All right, welcome to Fantasy Bankroll. I'm your host, Robert Banker. Each week I'll be here to break down matchups, uncover trends, and answer all your questions to help you make better lineup decisions. Whether you're grinding the waiver wire or just trying to avoid the last place finish in your league, you're in the right place. If it's fantasy, we'll talk about it here. All right, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for tuning in. With so much dead time in the offseason, I figured we'd take a look back and do a position-by-position review and see how the 2024 season ended and take a look ahead to the 2025 season. And whenever you're doing a position-by-position review, you always start with the most important position on the field, and that's the kickers. So, wait, no, it's not the kickers. No, it's who? Yeah. Well, I guess we're going to take a look at the quarterbacks. So let's see how they finished out the 2024 season. Are you sure it's not the kickers? Are you sure?
All right, so here's how the top 20 looked at the end of the year. As always with fantasy, there's some big surprises and big letdowns. The first guy to surprise was coming off a great season, but still flew under the radar to the tune of QB 21 last year, before finishing all the way up at QB 4. I'm obviously talking about Baker Mayfield, who had a great year with the Bucs. We can't talk about surprises last year and not mention Bo Nix, who was taking over in Denver as a rookie and was ranked as QB 23, but he made some fantasy GM's late round gambles pay off big time, finishing the season in the top 10 at QB 7. But what was probably the biggest surprise last season was Sam Darnold, who signed a one-year deal in Minnesota to come in and compete with last year's first-round pick J.J. McCarthy, before he was injured and the starting job was handed to Darnold. Darnold was a ridiculous QB 31, but finished as QB 9. He had a few bad games down the stretch, or he could have finished even higher. And who were some of the disappointments as far as fantasy goes last season? How about C.J. Strad, who was QB 5 with an ADP of 51st overall, and then ended up finishing as QB 18. And then there's Jordan Love. He was being drafted as QB 9. He did deal with some injuries early on, but he ended up finishing as QB 17. By far the biggest bust from last season was Anthony Richardson, and it's mainly based on his high ADP, being drafted QB 6 overall just behind Strad, before having a shit ton of injuries and only playing in 11 games, finishing as the QB 39 and only scoring a total of 72.7 points for the season. And I'm sure I speak for all fantasy GMs when I say that's just not going to cut it.
All right, that's how the quarterbacks finished up last year. It's always crazy to look back and see some of the surprises and see where you were right and wrong. Hopefully more right than wrong. But that's what I'm here for. All right, now I want to talk about a draft tool that I put together myself and I've used over the last few years to help show me where the point drop-offs are. I call it my tier list. Let's take a look.
Now let's talk scoring tiers. This is a tool I've used in the past when drafting, and it isn't about individual players, but positions and positional rankings specifically. The tiers are grouped into 5 players per tier, based on average Final Fantasy scoring ranks from the past 5 seasons. So Tier 1 is QBs 1 through 5, Tier 2, QBs 6 through 10, Tier 3, QBs 11 through 15, and so on. So how do I use it? I use it when I'm drafting to give myself an idea what the average point drop-off will be if I don't take a player who is, say, a Tier 1 quarterback to maybe take another player who is, say, a Tier 1 wide receiver, by comparing what the average scoring has been for those positions for the last 5 years. As you can see from the numbers, going from a Tier 1 quarterback to just a Tier 2 quarterback means that you're missing out on an average of 61 fantasy points per year, going from an average of 369.87 down to 308.74 points. And say you miss out on both the top tiers. You can see you're now picking from a group that averages 264.87 points per season for the last 5 years. And unless you're in a 2 quarterback or really deep league, hopefully you're not drafting from the 4th tier of quarterbacks for your fantasy team. Because as you can see there, that group, which consists of QBs 16 through 20, has only been able to average 226.44 points per season for the last 5 years. Or to put it a different way, 143 points less than the top tier is average during that same time. Now, this is just a tool to help guide you during the draft to see where the drop-offs in scoring occur. It's not foolproof, and obviously some players who are in one tier to start the season don't always finish there, due to injury, bad play, or better play. But when looking at all the other positional tier lists together, you'll get an idea of where those point drop-offs are for each position, which should help guide you during the draft.
Hopefully you'll be able to utilize the tier list during your drafts this upcoming season. Obviously once you have all the positional tier lists together. Now remember, it is just a guide and works best when combined with other information. Now let's take a look at this year's top incoming rookie quarterbacks and where they'll be beginning their careers.
All right, let's take a look at the rookie quarterbacks. This class was highlighted by Cam Ward going first overall to the Tennessee Titans. He'll start immediately and will instantly upgrade the quarterback position. Jackson Dart was the only other first-round quarterback, going 25th overall to the New York Giants, but he'll be buried on the depth chart to start the season behind Russell Wilson and Jameis Winston. Tyler Show went early in the second round in New Orleans, and he could actually see some time with the uncertainty around Derek Carr's injury, but he'll be battling it out with last year's 5th-round pick, Spencer Rattler. Jalen Milroe went in the 3rd round to Seattle, but they just signed Sam Darnold to a 3-year contract in the offseason. They do have an out after the 2nd year, so maybe Milroe sits for a year and then they battle it out next year. Next we have a pair of Cleveland Browns. Dylan Gabriel in the 3rd round and Shadir Sanders in the 5th round. I'm sure nobody heard anything about them during the draft. We round out the first 10 quarterbacks drafted last month with a quartet of 6th rounders. Kyle McCord going to the world champion Philadelphia Eagles, Will Howard going to the Pittsburgh Steelers, Riley Leonard going to the Indianapolis Colts, and Graham Mertz going to the Houston Texans. Of those 4, I think Will Howard stands the best opportunity to see any playing time this season. He's currently in a quarterback room with Mason Rudolph and Skylar Thompson. At this point in the offseason after the draft, Cam Ward is the only reasonable rookie fantasy quarterback option for the upcoming season. Now the only question is, can he pull a Jaden Daniels and Bo Nix and finish in the top 10? Leave me a comment and let me know where you think Cam Ward is going to finish this year. Do you think any of these other guys are going to finish in the top 20 or higher?
Will there be a surprise or two in that group like Bo Nix and Jaden Daniels last year? We shall see. Now for the first in a series of way too early positional rankings that are definitely going to change before August, let's check out the quarterbacks.
Number 15, C.J. Strad.
I get locked in. I am becoming more aware of where the camera is at all times. Deep shot, Stroud. Nico Collins is gone. Touchdown, Houston. 67 yards.
It was only his second season, but a lot was expected of Stroud coming off that surprising rookie season. And while the team's win total increased by 1, overall Stroud's numbers were down across the board. He threw for less yards, less touchdowns, and his completion percentage was down. The only numbers that went up were his interceptions from 5 to 12, and his sacks. He took 14 more than he did his rookie season. And as you saw, he finishes the 18th overall fantasy quarterback last year.
As I mentioned, he's only in his second season, but let's take a look at the numbers you're getting from Stroud as a fantasy GM. Through those first 2 years, he's averaged 3,917 yards passing, 21 touchdowns through the air. He's added 200 yards on the ground, and just over 1 rushing touchdown per season. I already mentioned that his rookie year was better in terms of stats, but that doesn't mean I'm not bullish on his chance to have a good season. The Texans' new offensive coordinator, Nick Caley, not sure how to pronounce that, is looking to put more responsibilities on Stroud's shoulders, which hopefully means more points for your fantasy team. There was a lot of changes in Houston during the offseason, but Stroud has raised the expectations the past 2 years, and he'll look to continue that trend this season. And if all his targets can stay healthy, he could be a top 10 fantasy quarterback for your team. Number 14, Dak Prescott.
Packers last year, but generally it's been a safe haven for him. Blitz coming, Prescott sees it, has a man in, slam, beautiful throw, Lamb gets away! CeeDee Lamb to the house, touchdown!
For the past 6 seasons, you've gotten a different Dak every other year. 1 year good, finishing 2nd in 2019, 7th in 2021, and 3rd in 2023. The next year bad, finishing 31st in 2020, 19th in 2022, and how about last year? How about 32nd? Not good enough, Dak. Does that mean we're in store for a bounce back year? Personally, I'm not sure Dak's going to have the bounce back he's looking for, and I'm not sure it'll be all his fault. The team has a new head coach in Brian Schottenheimer, a new offensive coordinator in Clayton Adams, the former offensive line coach from the Cardinals, and the team's best offensive lineman, Zach Martin, retired. You can say the Cowboys roster is in a state of flux, and who knows if it all will gel. But as a fantasy GM, this is the main question you'll have to ask yourself when it comes draft time and Dak's on the board. But if you do find yourself in that position, what do you get from Dak when he's healthy, you ask? How about an average of 4,124 yards and 28 passing touchdowns, as well as 268 yards and 4 touchdowns on the ground? Again, there's been a lot of changes in Dallas, and if everything clicks, and that's a big if, and if he stays healthy, and that's a big if, Dak has shown he can be a top 10 fantasy option for your team.
Number 13, Caleb Williams.
Tremaine Edmonds coming away with it. The ball was tipped, but a critical mistake by Richardson. Williams now looking deep for Adunze. He's got it to the 35. That's the big play Bears fans have been looking for. A gain of 45.
Williams posted a 60% completion percentage during the first 9 weeks of the season, and over the final 8 weeks, he had that number up to 65%. He averaged 1 passing touchdown a game over the first 9 weeks of the season, and by the final 8 weeks, that number was up to almost 1.5. He threw 6 interceptions on the season, 5 of which came during the first 9 weeks, and only 1 over the final 8 weeks. And during the final 8 weeks, he finished in the top 5 scoring 3 times for fantasy, and only once during the first 9 weeks. I think that just goes to show there was some progression being made by Caleb Williams towards the end of the year.
So what were the final numbers that Williams gave his fantasy GMs during his rookie year? How about 3,541 yards passing with 20 touchdowns and a crazy good 1.1 interception percentage? And while he didn't get into the end zone, he still accounted for almost 500 yards on the ground with 489 on the season. The team added some young offensive talent around Williams during the draft, and with the progression we were seeing at the end of his rookie year, there's no reason to think that Williams can't be a solid starting quarterback option for your fantasy team.
Number 12, Trevor Lawrence.
Five defensive backs, 3rd down and 10, Trevor Lawrence to the air. Harris in the block to the end zone. Caught!
He gets 1 down, 2 down.
Even before going on IR last season with an AC joint sprain and concussion, Lawrence was having the slowest start to a season since he came into the league. His yards per game were down almost 50 from 2023. His completion percentage was the lowest of his career. And while he's never been no Lamar Jackson, even his rushing totals were the lowest since his rookie season. The good news is that's the first time he's missed any game since he's come into the league. And the team also added a lot of weapons around him to help him bounce back this upcoming season.
Those added weapons I mentioned Lawrence will have at his disposal next season include 2nd overall pick Travis Hunter, who will pair with last year's amazing rookie receiver Brian Thomas Jr. And so just what were the numbers Lawrence was putting up his first 3 seasons? Well, I'm glad you asked. He averaged 3,923 yards passing, 19 touchdowns through the air, 321 yards, and 3.5 touchdowns on the ground. It's been a few years since Tank for Trevor, and Lawrence has never been a top-tier fantasy quarterback since coming into the league like a lot of people predicted, with his highest finish in fantasy being 7th in the season in 2022. But with all the talent the team added around him during the offseason, there's a good reason to think that he can get back into the top 10 this upcoming season.
Number 11, Jordan Love.
Have eyes-on vision on the quarterback.
Here's Love. Wide open. He's got Kraft. Tight ends running with a stiff arm. Kraft scored the distance. Tucker Kraft.
Love finished last season with 3,389 yards and 25 touchdowns through the air, and a meager 83 yards and 1 touchdown on the ground. He did miss 2 games early with an MCL sprain that contributed to his numbers being down. But coming off his first season as a starter, in which he threw for 4,192 yards and 32 touchdowns, and ran for 247 yards and 4 touchdowns, it's safe to say Love's second season was not what he expected. And it definitely wasn't what fantasy GMs expected when he was drafted as QB9, 74th overall last year. Now let's see what those 2 years have averaged out to.
Since taking over full-time 2 years ago, Love has thrown for an average of 3,774 yards and 29 touchdowns passing, and he's added 165 yards and 2 touchdowns per season on the ground. As I mentioned, he did miss 2 games last season, which definitely affected his numbers, but he didn't have the big scoring games like he did in 2023. Now, the only question you have to ask yourself as a fantasy GM during your draft is, are you getting closer to the 2023 or 2024 Love? If he stays healthy and with all the young talent around him, I'm guessing it'll be closer to the former.
Number 10, Justin Herbert.
Pass attempts per game. This is his 11th pass of the first quarter, and he's got an open man on the wheel route. It's the rookie Kamani Vidal, his first NFL touch.
After 2 straight years in which both his yards and touchdowns declined, in his first year under head coach Jim Harbaugh, Herbert saw a slight bounce back, passing for 3,870 yards and 23 touchdowns, with only 3 interceptions. He also added 306 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground. I do worry that no quarterback coached by Harbaugh has ever passed for over 4,000 yards in a season. But Herbert has the talent, so hopefully some familiarity in the system will help him get back closer to where he was his second season when he passed for over 5,000 yards and 38 touchdowns. Now let's take a look at his 5-year averages.
What are fantasy GMs getting from Herbert? Over his 5-year career, he's given you an average of 4,539 yards and 29 passing touchdowns per season. And he's also averaged 262 yards and 3 touchdowns on the ground. While his yards have been up there with the top-tier quarterbacks, I'd like to see him hit the 35-plus passing touchdown mark for the season, which Herbert has only hit once in his career. Or even take advantage of his athleticism and use those legs to get some more yards on the ground and get back closer to the 5 rushing touchdowns he scored his rookie year. If he can continue his bounce back in his second year under Harbaugh, there's no reason Herbert can't finish as a top 10 fantasy quarterback.
Number 9, Baker Mayfield.
And he's kind of back in that role and has a lot more opportunity.
On first down, Mayfield looking down the sideline. He's got Godwin again inside the 10, and he'll walk it in for a Tampa touchdown.
Mayfield has been draft gold the last 2 seasons. In 2023, he was QB 30, behind guys like Kenny Pickett and Sam Howell, before he finished as QB 10. Last season, he was QB 21, behind guys like Deshaun Watson and Anthony Richardson, before, as you saw in the recap, he finished as QB 5, throwing for 4,500 yards and 41 tutties. He also added 378 yards and 3 touchdowns on the ground. That 378 yards was the most of his career. Now, he did throw 16 interceptions to lead the league last season, but he's always been kind of a gunslinger, and I don't see that changing now. But let's take a look and see what fantasy GMs have gotten from Mayfield over the last 2 years in Tampa.
Tampa Mayfield has averaged 4,272 yards and 35 touchdowns through the air, and a little over 270 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground. However, last season he had over 200 more yards rushing than he ever had in a season, gaining 378 yards and scoring 3 touchdowns on the ground. Overall, you've gotten way above average play for where you've drafted in the past 2 seasons, and while he might not sneak under the radar this draft season, with all the talent added around him, Mayfield should be in line for another solid season for the Bucs. And if you somehow miss out on the top tier quarterbacks, Mayfield has shown he can be more than an adequate starter for your fantasy team. Number 8, Jared Goff.
It stays 28-20. Earmark that. Here is a completion to Jamison Williams. He is gone. Touchdown Lions.
Goff's fantasy ranks were trending one way during his last 3 seasons in LA, where he finished 7th, 13th, and then 19th. And his first season in Detroit didn't go much better, where he finished as the 24th ranked fantasy quarterback. But after that first season in the Motor City, things began to change. Goff finished 2022 ranked as the 10th quarterback, 2023 ranked as the 7th quarterback, before finishing as the 6th ranked quarterback last season, throwing for 4,629 yards and 37 touchdowns. Now let's see what you're getting from Goff as a fantasy GM. For his career, Goff's averaged 4,246 yards and 27 passing touchdowns per season. But let's just take a look at the last 3 seasons with Detroit, where his averages have been 4,547 yards and 32 touchdowns passing. And with the weapons around Goff, there's no reason to think he'll be in for a letdown next season. Now, while he isn't in the top tier quarterback talk due to his lack of ground game, over the past 3 years he's been drafted as QB 15, 111 overall last year, QB 17, 128th overall in 2023, and QB 27, 195th overall in 2022. And if you can get a top 10 quarterback at any of those spots in the draft, as a fantasy manager, you'll take that any day of the week.
Number 7, Patrick Mahomes.
3rd and 12, deep drop Mahomes. Runs away to find space, fires on the run to Kelsey to the 30-yard line. A perfect play for Patrick Mahomes to set the Chiefs' record for most passing yards, passing the legendary Lenny Dawson.
As you saw in the recap, Mahomes finished last season as QB 12. He hasn't finished higher than QB 8 or thrown more than 27 touchdown passes in the last 2 seasons. He was dealing with some injuries to some key pieces last season, with Rashee Rice, Isaiah Pacheco, and Hollywood Brown all missing time. With everyone back healthy to start the season, that should provide a jolt to the stat department for Mahomes. Now let's see what you've gotten from Mahomes historically as a fantasy GM.
Mahomes' career averages have been 4,581 yards and 35 touchdowns passing, and 319 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground. But from 2018 to 2022, Mahomes averaged just over 38 touchdowns and 4,791 yards passing, and 307 yards and 3 touchdowns on the ground. But during the past 2 seasons that seen him finish outside the top 7 scoring at the quarterback position, his averages have dropped to 4,055 yards and 26 touchdowns through the air, and 370 yards and only 1 touchdown on the ground. Which by themselves aren't bad numbers, but they're not the numbers that we as fantasy GMs have come to expect from Mahomes. So the questions fantasy GMs will have to ask is, will you be getting closer to the Mahomes that we've seen the past 2 years, or closer to the old Mahomes? With someone as competitive as Mahomes, and coming off what we all saw in the Super Bowl, and everybody being back healthy, I wouldn't bet against some sort of bounce back for this upcoming season. Number 6, Kyler Murray.
Fake to Connor. Murray on the rollout, looking deep for Harrison! Marvin Harrison Jr. to the end zone! Touchdown again!
Last year was the first time in 4 years that Murray played an entire season. He did post the second highest completion percentage of his career at 68.8%, as well as the second highest yardage total of his career at 3,851, to go along with 21 touchdowns. Both of those are lower numbers for what you'd want from your QB1 in fantasy, but he did make up for it by adding 572 yards and 5 touchdowns on the ground. Now let's see what you've gotten from Murray for his 6-year average.
Murray has yet to throw for more than 26 touchdown passes in a season, or hit the 4,000-yard passing mark once. And despite some of his passing shortfalls,
got him!
he's more than made up for it on the ground, averaging 645 yards and 7 touchdowns rushing per season, to go with 3,848 yards and 22 touchdowns passing. Murray has the dual capabilities to put himself in the top-tier fantasy quarterback conversation. But will it happen this season? The answer is maybe. If he can stay healthy again. You heard it was the first time he played a full season in 4 years. and he can take another step as a passer. These are the questions you're going to have to ask as a fantasy GM come draft time. Number 5, Joe Burrow.
Panthers rush 4. Burrow has lots of time, and there's Jamar Chase with the catch. Breaking tackles. Chase down the sidelines. Panthers chasing Chase. They won't catch him. 63 yards. Pinballing off tacklers to give the Bengals the lead.
Last season, Burrow was spectacular, putting up MVP-type numbers, completing over 70% of his passes for 4,918 yards and 43 touchdowns, with only 9 interceptions. And while he's never going to run for over 500 yards, he did add a respectable 201 yards on the ground and 2 touchdowns, including that 47-yard scamper against the Giants.
Everybody to the left. Burrow takes off to the right.
Speaking of 500 yards on the ground, Burrow was the only quarterback to finish in the top 5 last season that didn't rush for 500 yards and 4 touchdowns, highlighting just how good he was through the air. Now let's see what he's given you historically when he's healthy.
In seasons he stayed healthy, Burrow's finished 8th, 3rd, and 4th in fantasy scoring, and averaged 4,668 yards passing and 37 touchdowns through the air. And while Burrow can move better than most people think, he still doesn't give you much in the way of yardage on the ground, averaging just under 200 yards per season, but he has made up for it a little bit by averaging 3 touchdowns rushing as well. In this day and age in fantasy, Burrow is one of the rare top-tier quarterbacks that doesn't offer the dual-threat capability that some of the other quarterbacks in the upper echelon bring to the team. He offers you a consistent quarterback for your fantasy team that's going to score points, and he's not someone who's going to have a lot of letdown performances. His completion percentage has been among the league leaders since he entered the league, and he currently holds the NFL all-time record for completion percentage for a career at 68.6%. And with T and Jamar, plus all of his other top weapons coming back, there's no reason to think that Burrow can't finish in the top 5 again this year. If you have a chance to draft him for your fantasy team, I say, do it. Number 4, Jaylen Herz.
There is no real weaknesses to go with Jaylen Herz.
Second down and 7. Hertz with time. Lofts it over the top. Brown's got it. There goes A.J. Brown. Blinding speed. Brown. Touchdown. 67 yards.
Last season, Hertz didn't even crack 3,000 yards and 20 touchdowns through the air, throwing for 2,903 yards and 18 touchdowns. But he did add 630 yards and 14 touchdowns on the ground. That 14 touchdowns was good enough for 5th best in the league, and a big reason why he finished in the top 5 scorers 7 times last season. Now let's take a look and see what Hertz has averaged over his first 4 seasons as a starter. As a fantasy option, Hertz has never been the most prolific passer, never passing for more than 23 touchdowns in a season, and he's never thrown for more than 4,000 yards in a season. But where he's really shined in the fantasy realm has been on the ground, where he's averaged almost 695 yards and 12 touchdowns per season.
Hertz on a sneak, pile drives his way in, touchdown.
To go with just over 3,400 yards passing and 20 touchdowns through the air. Those numbers combined are the reason Hertz hasn't finished outside the top 7 quarterbacks in fantasy scoring since he took over full-time in 2021. And coming off a Super Bowl MVP performance, I think he's poised for another high fantasy finish. And if you have the chance to take him, your roster will thank you. Number 3, Lamar Jackson.
The quarter begins with 2nd and 17, and the Chiefs leading by 10. Lamar Jackson chased by Chanel. Karlaftis to Likely downfield. Isaiah Likely with a block down the sideline. Likely inside the 5 to the end zone. Touchdown.
Obviously, Jackson had a great year last year, finishing 2nd in MVP voting to Josh Allen. But how great was it? He threw for 4,172 yards and 41 touchdowns, with only 4 interceptions. Good enough for a ridiculous .8 interception percentage. He also added 915 yards and 6 touchdowns on the ground. That 915 yards was good enough for 20th in the league. For running backs. Jackson passed the ball more than he ever had in his career, and he still managed to take care of the ball better than he ever has. Well, that was last year. How's he done for fantasy GMs in the past? Let's take a look. In the seasons Jackson's fully been healthy for the whole season, he's given fantasy owners 3,433 yards through the air and 32 passing touchdowns, while adding an additional 986 yards and almost 6 touchdowns on the ground. Only twice in his career has Jackson thrown for 35 or more passing touchdowns in a season, one of which was last season. But even when he's not slinging it around, his legs are more than a threat to change any game. Other than injuries, Jackson has been one of those quarterbacks that you stick in and only worry about for the bye week. And if he continues to pass the ball like he did last season and do what he's always done on the ground, then there's no reason he shouldn't be a top target in your fantasy
drafts. Number 2, Jaden Daniels.
inbounds. They're made to play in these styles. Now they can just unleash at the quarterback.
Half a minute, no timeouts. Daniels throws down the sideline for Terry McLaurin. McLaurin is loose. Lightning strikes twice in Washington.
Daniels had an outstanding rookie season, completing 69% of his passes for 3,568 yards and 25 touchdowns, with only 9 interceptions. He also added 891 yards and 6 touchdowns on the ground. That 891 yards put him ahead of running backs like Breece Hall, Tyrone Tracy, and Ramondre Stevenson.
After one season, Daniels is already a top-tier fantasy quarterback option. And the Commanders added even more support for their young star during the offseason, trading for wide receiver Deebo Samuel from the 49ers and left tackle Laramie Tunsil from the Houston Texans. He's already shown he can be incredibly accurate, but if he can take another step as a passer while maintaining the ground game, he could easily challenge for the top overall scorer spot for the 2025 fantasy season. And I can guarantee you, barring an injury, you'll regret not taking Daniels if he's available in your fantasy draft.
Number 1, Josh Allen.
Fakes left, now taken off. Gonna run for it, he got it! And there he goes! Inside the 10, the 5! Oh, the play of the year in the NFL!
Second, first, second, first, and sixth. Those are Allen's fantasy finishes over the last 6 seasons. Obviously, he won the MVP award last season and got a new 6-year, $330 million contract with $250 million guaranteed. But last season wasn't even his best statistically. He threw for 3,751 yards and 28 touchdowns, both his lowest totals in 5 years. But he made up for it on the ground with 531 yards rushing and 12 touchdowns. Those 12 touchdowns were good enough for 9th in the league.
What does NFL MVP Josh Allen give you as a fantasy GM? First off, he's incredibly durable, holding the current longest active streak of 114 straight games. So you only need a QB2 for the bye week. And now for the numbers. How does an average of 4,048 yards and 30 touchdowns through the air, as well as 634 yards and 10 touchdowns on the ground sound? Pretty damn good as a fantasy GM. Which is why he's finished so highly ranked these past 6 seasons. Allen is clearly in the top tier fantasy quarterback options, and if you have the chance to take him in your fantasy draft, you won't be disappointed. All right, here we go. And rounding out the top 20, I've got Brock Purdy at 16, Bo Nix at 17, Tua at 18, Michael Penix Jr. at 19, and Bryce Young at 20. And next up, we've got Sam Darnold, Geno Smith, Cam Ward, Matthew Stafford, J.J. McCarthy, and Anthony Richardson. Again, these are way too early, and they'll definitely change before the season starts. But I wanted to put something out there just so I have a baseline. And what else are people going to roast me about if I don't put out a way too early list? Never mind, don't answer that. All right, that'll do it for the very first episode of Fantasy Bankroll. Thank you so much for checking it out. Make sure you come back and check out the next episode where I'll be taking a look at the running backs. And big shout out to my man Santino Corleone for providing the music. All right, hit that subscribe button, tap that notification bell, and leave me a comment. Let me know what you thought about today's episode. And let's get started stacking wins and building that fantasy bankroll. But first, we got an offseason to navigate and drafts to dominate, baby. So let's go.